Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Colin Deppen. I am a newsletter editor here at Spotlight PA. We're thrilled to have you spending your Thursday night with us, and we're thrilled to be here with this excellent panel discussing Pennsylvania's queer media history. First, for those of you who aren't familiar with Spotlight PA's programming, Spotlight PA is an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom, produces investigative journalism on Pennsylvania state government, urgent statewide issues. And none of that work is possible without the support of people like you. You can learn how to support us by visiting us at spotlightpa.org. And a few housekeeping items. Tonight's event will be recorded and posted on our website tomorrow for those who couldn't be here live. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question in advance. If you'd like to submit a question during the event, you can do so in the Q&A section. It's at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to those towards the end of the program. Tonight's program. So we are here talking about queer media history in Pennsylvania before the internet. Before the first federally recognized Pride Month in June of 1999, America's queer community relied on a sprawling network of often underground newsletters, newspapers, and zines to share information. That media movement started in large cities, but it would spread to places like central Pennsylvania through a number of pioneering outlets. We're going to talk about those outlets tonight with an excellent panel of guests, and we're going to let them introduce themselves, starting with Barry.
Hi, I'm Barry Loveland. I use he, him pronouns. I am chair of the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania's History Project. And our mission is to discover, document, collect, preserve, and present the history of the LGBTQ community in Central Pennsylvania through oral history and material culture.
Megan.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's good to be with you. Tonight, my name is Megan Mastinelli. I use she and they pronouns. I am the Archives and Special Collections Engagement and Outreach Librarian at the University of Pittsburgh Library System in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And part of my job is helping to preserve, make accessible, and conduct outreach with underground LGBTQ publications, primarily published in Pittsburgh, but also throughout the country.
And Frank.
Hi, my name is Frank Pizzoli, and you may remember me from Central Voice, which was a newspaper here in the region. I've been lucky to work for many, many years in gay and both mainstream media, and be a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you all. First question. I would like to ask all of our panelists, what were some of your first experiences with queer media, and how did those early experiences impact you? Barry, you mind kicking us off?
Sure. Yeah, my first job out of graduate school was in Montgomery, Alabama, working for the Alabama Historical Commission, and I had come out as a gay man in college. So by the time I got to my first job, I was openly gay. But Montgomery had no gay organizations whatsoever when I arrived. There were a few in Birmingham, and one of those organizations published a tabloid format newspaper called the Alabama Forum. And it became my initial connection to the community in Alabama at the time. It really enabled me to start 3 gay organizations in Montgomery when I was there. And I was also able to run the second annual gay conference, statewide gay conference in Alabama. And I wrote articles for the Alabama Forum about things that were going on in Montgomery, that I was kind of their Montgomery correspondent, if you will. So that was probably my first experience in working with gay media or knowledge about gay media. The other experience is when I came to Pennsylvania, and I was considering applying for a job in Harrisburg. And so I decided to look up Harrisburg in Bob Damron's address book, which was a national gay guide to resources and so forth. And so I found the Gay and Lesbian Switchboard in Harrisburg listed there. And so I called them and talked to one of the volunteers, and they gave me the lowdown on what the Harrisburg gay life was all about and what was like living there. They told me that the city had just passed a new non-discrimination ordinance. This was 1983. And they told me that the state employees were already protected through executive order. So that really entered my decision because I was applying for a job to work for the state at the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, and that made my decision easy. So that contact with the media was really important in knowing that I would have a community to come to.
Great. Megan, can you share your experience?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that was so great, Barry. Thanks for sharing. So I grew up in the, I sort of was in high school and college in the early 2000s. And even though I had I had access to internet, I had a computer in my family home. And so some of my first exposure to LGBTQ media was online. But because I work so much in print, I was also thinking about what was my first print culture exposure. And I'm originally from Little Rock, Arkansas, and I'm a librarian now. I've always been a big fan of libraries. And so my local library had a used bookstore, and I actually found a copy of Rita Mae Brown's Plain Brown Wrapper, second wave feminist, lesbian, lavender menace icon who wrote a bunch of mystery novels involving cats, but also was like a lesbian theorist, and published this book with some really like cool, funky illustrations in it as well. And it kind of, I remember reading it and it just really expanding my brain. I was like, I'm not really sure what this is, but like, I really like it and I really want to figure it out. And so connecting with physical media like that, and also finding zines. So if you're not familiar with what a zine is, it's like a DIY do-it-yourself magazine that's often made through cut and paste, photocopying, really cheap, easy way to distribute ideas and artwork. And I learned about Sylvia Rivera, the incredible trans activist, through a zine. I'd never heard of this, I didn't learn about it in high school or in college. And so those pathways that were more or less a little bit random really helped me find, affirmation with who I was becoming as a young adult, and really made me excited about helping other people connect with those kinds of media through library and archives work. I later went on to work at the University of Arkansas Special Collections with some materials that belong to a local lesbian free library, and really got familiar with the oeuvre of especially Southern LGBTQ publications. And that's what inspired me to go to graduate school so that I could work more with media across the country.
Wonderful. What about you, Frank?
Very similar experiences to Megan and Barry. I first got to Harrisburg in the winter of 1974, so I was doing what Barry was doing, and also Megan. Later, you would look for a flyer, you would look for a postcard, you would look for a sentence or a paragraph inside something else that had maybe what would be coded language to someone who's not part of the community, but you kind of figured it out. Bob Dameron, I forgot about that, Barry. That was the big book of, dare I say, Bible of where everybody and everything was, and just year after year after year, judiciously put together, down to the last detail anybody could find. And people would also submit to that. It was kind of like a group effort. And the one experience this question did make me think about was our intramural volleyball team that we had for years and years and years in Harrisburg. And we wanted to break out of that and be a little more involved in the community. Not just to get some more players involved, but also to do something that would be kind and nice in our own neighborhoods. And we decided that it would be a newsletter. And the post office said, well, you need 100 names in order to get a discount in the postage. So make that your goal. And we did. And long story short, eventually we had a list. And we went back to them and they said, now sort it out by zip code. And we said, okay, we're all novices at this. We go back and literally had a work night at somebody's kitchen table, separated them, got everything together, and then we made piles. And there was 3 in this pile, 2 in that pile, 5 in this pile, and most of them in 17102. And we said, golly gee, that's where we're sitting right now. And that's where most of us who have responded to this effort must live. And that sort of became a catch-all, that's the neighborhood in Harrisburg. That's no longer true. That's no longer true in many places like Harrisburg, larger and smaller, where there might have been a section, a neighborhood, a block. We're, as we always have been, we're everywhere now.
Fascinating, Frank. Thank you all. I want to ask Barry to talk a little bit about the History Project's upcoming Spreading the News exhibit. And I also want to ask Barry to tell us a little bit about how this media was created and shared. What were sort of like, how was this distributed? These early examples.
Sure. Well, the exhibit opens on June 21st from 5 to 8 p.m. and it's called Start Spreading the News. And it talks about the evolution of LGBTQ plus media in central Pennsylvania, particularly. The opening coincides with Third and the Burg, which is Harrisburg's sort of monthly night where a lot of the galleries and museums and so forth have openings and special events and so forth. So I hope people will come out and see it. So yeah, the newspapers or newsletters, which typically were where this all started, would be published by local organizations that were just starting out. They might have a flyer or a calendar of events or a newsletter, and so a lot of these were handwritten or mimeographed copies of publications. They were distributed a lot of times at the gay bars because that's the only place that people knew where gay people were congregating so that they could reach them. So a lot of those kinds of early publications and so forth really reached their audience through a lot of handwork, a lot of very laborious handwork. Earlier at the national level, there were organizations that were creating publications that were distributed nationally. One incorporated out of Los Angeles, the Mattachine Society had the Mattachine Review. Daughters of Bilitis had the Ladder. The Advocate started as an independent publication, not affiliated with any particular organization. So some of those very, very early organizations and publications would be sent out through the mail, and they would be sent out through subscription. And so you might run into a copy in going to Philadelphia or someplace like that and decide to subscribe to them. So that's how you might, figure out how to get in touch with those different publications and organizations. So yeah, it was a struggle for both the people who were publishing to try to reach an audience, and also a struggle for the audience to try to find the publications.
I have a question for Megan. Prior to publications like this, what were some of the ways the queer community connected and shared information typically?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And as someone who works with print media, primarily, it's hard for me to share that because in our collections, what we have is what was created. But I think like Barry was saying, you know, people going to bars as a communication hub, and other locations. Oh, I made a few notes about this too. Yeah, I think like when I think about local community members connecting with each other, there's certainly evidence in some of these newsletters that Barry just mentioned. The Ladder, for example, talks about the Homophile Student League that was started at Columbia in the late 1960s. It was sort of the first registered student organization of its kind. In the Ladder, they talk about, or perhaps the Daughters of Bilitis newsletter, they talk about reaching out to students at the University of Pittsburgh as one of their first, you know, colleges that they're reaching out to students to, and maybe that's because of proximity to the state. And there are, you know, a number of other publications. A little bit later, there's a publication called Transgender Tapestry, which is out of Massachusetts, but it also serves as a community publication for communication and information sharing and organizing. And there was an organization called Trans Pitt, which University of Pittsburgh, some people may know, gets shortened to Pitt sometimes, but this wasn't actually affiliated with the university. It was just Pittsburgh and they shortened it to that. But the founder of that organization is writing in a national publication like Transgender Tapestry to reach people not only in Pittsburgh, but more broadly. So I think when I was sort of thinking about this question, I was thinking about how locally folks might have reached other people through some of these national publications before there was more of a local media to connect through.
Barry, I'm gonna share some slides of photos our panelists were great enough to share with us, so everyone can see sort of some examples of what we're talking about. Barry, can you tell us what would a reader find inside the pages of an early outlet like Drum from Philadelphia, The Gay Era from Lancaster? Barry, you're muted, Barry, if you could.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, publications like The Gay Era, for example, included news articles about the activities of national gay organizations. They would include things like how gays were being portrayed in film or on television, and news about governmental laws and organizational policies that were being changed or needed to be changed and how they affected gay people. It included features like book reviews, short story fiction, poetry, artwork, biographies of celebrities whose sexual orientation was a subject of speculation, perhaps. And it also had editorials. It had letters to the editor, reports on the activities of local gay organizations, such as the Pennsylvania Rural Gay Caucus. And it included a calendar of local gay events and a listing of resources. There were ads for local gay bars and gay-owned businesses. A publication like Drum, which was based in Philadelphia, that published by the Janus Society, one of the earliest organizations in the state. It was geared to a more national audience, even though it was a regional publication. It had a lot of national and international news, and included a lot of different kinds of features, stories, letters to the editor, book reviews, fiction, cartoons. It had a pretty good sized classified ads section, and also had some rather sexy photographs of males, you might say. Not entirely nude, but nonetheless fairly erotic. And that was a calculated thing about that the publishers had, was to try to expand their audience to a much larger national audience. And it was actually the largest circulation magazine of its time. So it worked.
It's great. And that last slide, for anyone wondering, is a collection of current outlets to the Philadelphia Gate News, Q-Burg, and Pittsburgh. The next question I want to ask Frank. You are the founder and publisher of The Central Voice, in addition to a decade's worth of writing experience. So can you tell us a little bit about the process of sort of creating a publication from the ground up?
Yes, I can say that when I started out, it was one that was greeted with a great deal of support, which at the time was surprising to me. There was a greater awareness that we were an overlooked market. And in business terms, it made sense to people. Why would you leave market on the table, so to speak? Why would you leave money on the table? I came at it from a point of view that it was a business plan first, and trying not to convince people that they needed to be involved because it was a civil rights issue, at least not initially. I did not think that was the way to go. And no one actually required or went that way. I basically said, we're here 24/7, 365 days out of the year, and we can be reached, and we can participate in a media outlet, and you can make that now part of your market and demographic. The two groups that initially came forward, and when I look back, it makes sense that it didn't right in the moment, were larger institutions, hospital systems, health insurance systems, who were maybe ahead of smaller organizations or mom and pop size business. But because they employed such large workforces, they had already dealt with LGBTQ issues in one fashion or another, so that none of this was startling to them. None of this was new information to them. It made a great deal of sense when you said, well, look within your own employee base, or just look around. Why would you not want to have your logo, your service, your goods in front of this audience? And that really carried a lot of weight. The other thing, when you're small, you can go to someone else who's small and say, we know what it's like to be the little person on the block, and there will be room in here for you. This isn't going to be expensive advertising that a mom and pop size business cannot afford. And that formula seemed to work. Davy Goldsmith, who at the time was owned and managed Harrisburg Magazine and Lehigh Magazine, I went to him, I pitched him, he understood, shook his head, and I basically said, you give me your sales team and your graphics department, and I will give you words and images. And we approached it as a plan and said, let's check in a year and a half later, look at all the numbers, and it looked like a go. It was. We were successful with it, happily. And a little more transition steps that a new startup would go through, and we eventually ended up with Press and Journal in Middletown, which was owned by Joe and Louise Sukol. They had always physically printed the newspaper, and so now we went full-fledged into their operation, and it was run out of there. They became the parent company. And we went for almost 2 decades until COVID, like it did with a lot of enterprises. It was time to stop.
I want to ask you about the transition from print to digital in a moment. But first, any stories or interviews from your career that really sort of stand out?
They do. My interview with the Pulse owner, Barbara Poma, I can still hear the sound of her voice as she's describing the bands. You can hear the obvious and understandable emotion that is there. She and her husband and a small group of people that were involved there for, initially had a feeling of, is this us? What did we do here? And it was probably the most emotionally raw interview I had ever conducted. I happened to be in Key West when that occurred in a combination work and play vacation. So we were right nearby, and although we certainly were not part of the event, Key West ends their festival with a parade rather than starting it, and that reflects their business model. I want to draw everybody in first, and then we'll have a good parade. And waking up that morning, where all those of us that were there to help with the local Chamber of Commerce, which had 101 members and all but 2 were gay businesses, we said, we cannot do what we were planning to do, obviously, and didn't know what to do. So all of that is, in my experience and in my memory, is all rolled into one. And I think the other one is my interview of Salman Rushdie that I was lucky enough to interview. He had covered the trials and tribulations of a transgender individual in one of his, in the novel at the time, that I had interviewed him. And certainly, as we know from recent experience, he knows what hate and violence is. And it was very surprising to hear how lighthearted the man is. I would not have, prior to that, had no exposure to him, and speaking to him, thought that's the strength that's kept him. That is the strength that's kept him going and filled him with energy to continue. And that touched me very personal in that way. And I'm happy to tell you that in about 6 months, early 2025, I'll have a collection of interviews, 20 of his, Rushdie's, names that are not household names, but in our community, Edmund White, Felice Picano, Andrew Holloran, they've all written books that people of my generation, Barry's generation, younger and older, would remember. And they reveal a great deal in there, what it was like for them as writers and authors, going through some of the same steps that we're and evolutions that we're talking about here this evening.
We're going to get a little more forward facing in a second. But Megan, I wanted to ask you about the University of Pittsburgh library system, and it highlighted similar materials about Pittsburgh's queer community, specifically over 50 years in a news story you all did with KDKA TV. What were some of your findings? What sort of stood out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the University of Pittsburgh Library System, we do hold a pretty sizable collection of local LGBTQ press materials, including maybe like 6 or 7 pretty big Pittsburgh titles. I'm going to go to my notes here so I don't forget anything. But some of my findings, I'll start with that. Before doing this news story, I, as an outreach librarian, do a lot of instruction with these materials. I support researchers using these materials. So I had some familiarity with the content, but kind of reviewing things for that news story and for this panel, quite frankly, I sort of was recognizing some themes and really interesting things that I think are really relevant to contemporary issues as well. So one is in the publication, I think we've all kind of alluded to this too, there's a lot of organizing that's happening. I think now, a lot of people use Instagram or online platforms, but people were doing this in print. And the coalitions that I recognized going through some of the issues of, student groups, community groups. For example, in 1972, this is a really big year in Pittsburgh queer history, as far as I can tell, where 3 main groups emerge at least in a periodical published by one of those groups, the Gay Alternatives Pittsburgh, Lesbian Feminists, and the Gay Students at Pitt. And they go together to several events to protest or forcibly set up information tables about LGBTQ people for the attendees. And I think that, coalitions are really important, and something that I think gets, maybe there's an illusion that is a new idea, things like that. There are also many different purposes for some of these publications. So one publication, Gay Life, that there were some images in that slideshow that you presented. It was really focused on social life of Pittsburgh. So there were lots of stories of what happened in the bars that week, candids, a lot of event listings, but there were other publications that were much more news focused. And a lot of those changes came about because of reader input and surveys that publishers would collect, that were later published even in those publications. One major thing that I just think about with some of these historical titles, and having them in the archive and being used by people is that it is evidence of existence, right? So one major purpose of having media is to prevent isolation, especially at times when there's really not a lot of great representation, a lot of harm being done. And so those are some major things that I think came out in looking through those periodicals. But a few of I mentioned a few of the earlier ones are from the early 1970s. So that was a really big time in our region.
So obviously we've all seen these seismic disruptions of the media industry's shift from print centric to digital. Frank, I wanted to ask you, given your experience, how the LGBTQ plus media landscape or outlets in particular fared during that transition, generally speaking.
It's generally about the same as everyone. The market's blind to sexual and gender identities. So what affected one affected it all. I can say over time, the publications that I have written for Instinct magazine, which was Genre magazine, was another one that is no longer with us. Instinct, for example, was print and online, and just slowly print went away, and it is now only online and not the same as it was. No media outlet ever stays the same, but it has it's skewed towards younger rather than a fuller demographic. I wrote for Windy City Times in Chicago. It was a weekly that was there for many years. That just folded up, and it's now a quarterly insert into something larger, to the Chicago Reader. Is there. So people have either completely disappeared through the disruptive technologies. Craigslist did not discriminate. Even the Village Voice that I do now, which was often tagged the nation's first alternative weekly newspaper, founded by Norman Mailer and a couple others, is almost completely online. We tried some print here and there, but that has changed radically. Not in its coverage, not in its approach, but in just how it presents itself to the public. It's difficult to maintain the identity too in today's world, because our publications got to start by addressing different pieces and parts of our own demographic within the gay community. You see that LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender questioning. And what's happening now is, just in terms of business survival, those sort of dominoes on the board have to come together. It's starting, it's happening. Some of the major players are sharing content rather than everybody doing everything. And that has created some temporary stability and some new ways of approaching. But it's been basically the same, and for some a little worse, because it was our media, queer media, has never really, other than a couple of big players, Advocate and Out, and like that, is not a heavily financed endeavor.
Frank, you mentioned demographics. How have outlets like yours, and this question open to the entire panel, how have queer media outlets gotten better about speaking to other demographics that have been historically overlooked within the industry? And specifically, I'm talking about people of color. Have you seen an evolution? Have you seen changes, positive changes in terms of representation, intersectionality, things of that nature? And Frank, feel free to, you could take the lead on that.
That tags along to the question you had just previously asked. Some publications, for example, Vogue, I believe it is, says them. They have done what are called verticals in the business, or they're doing some specific newslettering, where before, when you were one entity, when you were X number of pages monthly or weekly, you had everybody was visible in the same place. And the new technologies have allowed, for example, with the kind of newslettering that you can tailor to an audience. Well, not everybody has to be aware of what everybody else is being presented, and not everybody has to decide what they're going to read from the same table of contents. That may make more sense to us who live this and breathe this. The question, I think, in today is, how do you attract a demographic to a media outlet that formerly maybe didn't go after it in the light of day, has a broad demographic itself? So what the market has done and what the big publications have done is their add-ons, their special pubs, their occasional pubs, so that if you're looking at everything under the umbrella of a publisher's job or an executive editor's job, there's a whole lot more moving parts to it, because as internet and technology and social media and marketing has sort of atomized everything, so is your demographic you're trying to appeal to. And that, no one, I don't believe, has figured that out yet completely. There are some success stories, but it's kind of, put the marbles on a tray and tilt it one way and everything goes one way and then the other. That's no longer the case. Demographics and readership is all over the place. We have to figure out how to reach it now.
I want to get to some audience questions in just a minute. But for the whole panel, I would really like to sort of know where you see this going. So what do you see the role as for LGBTQ media today in this moment of political backlash? Has its role changed at all in the digital era? Sort of, where does this go from here?
Well, I think that, like the demise of many exclusively gay bars, we've seen the demise of many of the LGBTQ plus specific media. Mainstream media has really become better, I think, at covering LGBTQ topics and the community than it has in the past. It's difficult to financially support. As Frank mentioned, a lot of this requires a good capitalization, and it's tough for a lot of independent media to really stand alone in certain markets to try to specialize in that. So social media, search engines have made it so easy for LGBTQ people to find resources, events, organizations, the information on the news that they're looking for, and other materials once only found in LGBTQ specific media. So I think it's a tougher environment for independent LGBTQ plus media. There are some bright spots, I think, but yeah, it just becomes tougher as time goes on when it's just there's such an explosion of independent. Everybody has the ability to publish things in the palm of their hand, so it's tough for them to compete that way.
Adding to what Barry has shared with us, my keywords for a long time when Voice was alive was align, align, and align, meaning join with and try to create the kind of relationships that will be lasting. For example, Central Voice was invited by Pennsylvania Capital Star to share copy both ways. That was a tremendous boost because our readership joined some of their readership, had the same kind of interest, not universally. The reason someone picked up Central Voice primarily was because it addressed the queer community, but like interests are all over the place. We're like anybody else. And so that sharing became great. I started receiving the feedback then, it's a good read because it wasn't only about the LGBT community. In acknowledgement that we're as varied as anybody else. We're a tiny minority within a larger minority, so we're kind of used to living in the world around everybody else. We're still trying to get everybody else used to living around us. So we're doing many of the same things, and that worked an awful lot. That worked really, really well because our readers were reading their stuff, their stories. And also, you know, a great supplier of content were the organizations within the region here, who were invited and always given space to tell their story and share their experiences. But when we organized the editorial to be literally international, national, state, regional, and local, plus bringing stories from other outlets that were not gay specific, but would be of interest to the gay community. That really invigorated the readership. And I think there's probably more I could have learned there, a ton more, but we had to go away, as did many good publications with the arrival of COVID.
Yeah, I'll just jump in as the last panelist here, and just to add to the really amazing points I think that Barry and Frank are making. I'm, you know, I know we're talking a lot now about news sites and newspapers and the business of that, and as a librarian and as an archivist, thinking about documenting those and thinking about some of the varying reasons and methods in which those things have been created over time. You know, Barry, you mentioned at the very beginning how really hands-on creating a lot of these publications was. I have a friend who was a layout person and like physically did the layouts for one of the Pittsburgh Queer newspapers. So I'm kind of like getting to my point, but I've been thinking a lot about visibility and connection and the importance of information sharing right now versus also some of the dangers around discrimination and possible surveillance, especially with digital media. And I'm seeing a real return in some ways to DIY culture and small runs of things. I mentioned zines earlier, but even like almost like the newsletter route, maybe created with software first and not hand layout. But yeah, I mean, I think over time, queer people have been really creative, and it depends on the purpose of the publication, I guess, the medium, but those are just a couple things that I've been thinking about.
Super interesting. I want to get to some audience questions. We have about 12 minutes left. There were mentions on the call of, the verticals. We've seen national outlets like HuffPost, NBC News, launch LGBTQ verticals, some very short-lived. Within all of that sort of change and turnover and turbulence, we've also seen the rise of services like Substack. Sue Kerr asks in the chat, what do you think of the emergence of Substack and similar subscription-based email newsletters authored by journalists and community members in a shrinking media market? Do they fill a gap? Open to the group.
I'm not really that familiar with them, so I think I'd probably defer to Frank. Probably has a little bit more of a handle on some of those things, or maybe Meg.
A recent conversation about Substack and resources like it. The individuals who felt they were successful, and these were not gay specific, these were people who were just out there, who maybe worked at one of the monoliths, and disruptive technology ushered them out the door. And what they felt was that they were very successful with a very small audience. That their readership that followed them was very much interested, would suggest stories, were involved with them as a journalist or writer in ways that you wouldn't be involved with your audience necessarily if you were working for a larger entity. But it's difficult to monetize and keep your nose above the water financially, because you need to have monthly paid subscriptions, and people are bombarded all the time with Substack requests. And I know what I have done is, okay, I'll do yours for 3 months and then yours for 3 months. I can't do everybody for 12 months. $5 doesn't sound like a lot unless you're, unless you're doing that times, a double-digit number, and you can also only read so much. So it's there, and it is successful for some people that I have talked to, but it becomes so far described as a real labor of love. And now I'm not talking about people who are boldface on page 6 to begin with, who open Substack. I'm talking about most of the people we find on Substack who are not that, or people that may have had some sort of writerly or journalistic profile, but that is very difficult. The other aspect of it that was mentioned is, although social media can help someone in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, find someone with like interest in Seattle, that's about as far as that goes. So I think people have acknowledged that, recognized that, or saying, but gee, wouldn't it be best to have a cup of coffee and pick one up from a stack at a local coffee house, so that Barry and I could actually sit and see each other as two human beings and talk. And that part is gone. That part is gone. So the information, as software and technologies do, provides a very efficient way, but a very impersonal way. And that's my sense of what the writers on the writer's side of it are dealing with, in addition to their readers.
Yeah, that's great. And touches on another question an audience member had, which was sort of what has been lost in the sort of expansion from these, hyper local outlets to maybe much larger ones covering, much vaster distances. So thank you for that, Frank. We have a couple more, and I would love to get to these if at all possible. Beth L has a question in the chat. What years were the first queer media available in Pennsylvania? Okay, Barry or Megan, can you ballpark or even put a finer point on that in terms of when this really started?
Yeah, so in central Pennsylvania, the Gay Era, which was probably the first more general circulation publication, started in 1974. The Philadelphia Gay News started in 1976, which covered, more the Philadelphia region, but also we had a lot of bleed into the central PA area, if you will, because the publication was around in the gay bars and newsstands and places like that for people to find. So yeah, that's kind of the general time frame for us. Megan, you probably have better sense.
Yeah, no, thanks, Barry. Yeah, it's very similar in the Pittsburgh region, and also say like something we didn't touch on. Didn't get to touch on too much is that a lot of the Pittsburgh publications are billed as tri-state publications, so covering West Virginia and Ohio too. But the first like explicitly queer, more professional publication that we have in our collections was started in 1972. So just like a few years before some of the ones Barry's talking about. And a lot of that is because all these organizations are popping up. There's information to share. Some of those like state laws of anti-discrimination or empowering people, things like that.
I should have probably mentioned too that Drum, the publication that the Janus Society published in Philadelphia, was started, I think, around 62, something like that. So yeah, that was pretty early. And so that does precede these other ones.
I want to give everyone a little bit of time before we go to plug any upcoming projects. Barry, if you want to remind everyone of the History Project's upcoming exhibit, please take a moment to do so.
Yeah, sure. So the exhibit opens on June 21st, 5 to 8 p.m. We're having a reception, opening reception. It'll be on exhibit for about 3 months. So if you don't get a chance to go that evening, please stop by the LGBT Center on 1323 North Front Street in Harrisburg, and visit sometime else when you can. And I would just say in general for the History Project that we've been doing this for 12 years, documenting the history of the LGBTQ plus community in central Pennsylvania. And we would love to get more people involved in our project, either donating artifacts and archival materials or sitting for an oral history interview. There's no age limit or background requirements, just whatever people are interested in telling their life story, we'd be happy to help document that.
And Barry, apologies if I missed it. What is the best way for people to get in touch in order to do that?
Sure. The best way is to reach us by email at history@Central Pennsylvania Central PA LGBT Center.org.
Wonderful. Frank, you had something, a project upcoming that you wanted to discuss as well, correct?
Yes, I do. You had asked me about interviews that had stuck with me. And I am been lucky to have a publisher interested in publishing 20 interviews over the years, and it'll be out early 2025. And the people that I have interviewed were the starters of it all, so to speak. These are names, men, women, and people who've also written about them that may not be gay themselves, but wrote a book. And I interviewed them. Gore Vidal's biographer, Jay Perini, who's a Pennsylvanian from outside of Nanticoke, PA, interestingly enough, and a good friend of Vidal's, Michael Mushaw, where we're able to get into the interior of some of these people that we do know as boldface names, and have those experiences shared. And it's been my pleasure to do all that. And I feel lucky that I have the opportunity to pull them together.
And Megan, anything upcoming at the University of Pittsburgh Library System? What are you working on?
Yeah, we always have new things, but something I would love to emphasize is that our collections are open and available to anyone. You don't have to be a University of Pittsburgh affiliate. Even if you're not in Pittsburgh, we do some remote reference. I also love to hear about people's experiences. If you worked on one of these publications, it's always really helpful to add more information and more context to some of these resources that sometimes we get without too much of that. And I'm plugging in the chat my email address. You're welcome to get in touch with me, as well as a guide to some of these Queer Press collections that you can access.
Terrific. That will about do it for tonight. I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed this. I learned a ton. I hope you all watching did as well. A million thank yous to our panelists tonight. A reminder that the event, for those who couldn't be with us live, will be on spotlightpa.org in the coming days. There's a plug right in the chat, a link right there in the chat, so you can keep that. And again, thank you. If you want to support our work, please also go to spotlightpa.org. Reach out to us. We're very easy to reach. It was a pleasure. Thank you all again for being here. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.